Welcome to Primetime News. It's Sunday, April 20th here in Seoul. I'm Choi Yu-sun.
And I'm Sean Lim. Thank you so much for joining us. Over the past few days, the government has been working on declaring the two areas affected by the accident as special disaster zones. One is Ansan in Gyeonggi-do province near the capital Seoul, and the other is Jindo-gun County in the southwestern province of Jeollanam-do.
Officials passed the measures today, and for details, we now go to our Laah Hyun-kyung standing by at the news center. Hyun-kyung.
Well, it was around 6:40 p.m. Korea time when those two areas officially became special disaster zones. Jindo-gun County is where Paengmok-hang harbor is, the harbor closest to the sunken ferry, and Ansan is where Danwon High School is, the high school where most of the students on the ferry were from. The two areas will now be able to quickly receive state funds for the search and rescue operation. Also, local taxes, including acquisition tax, will be waived. Other general taxes will either be reduced or the payment deadline will be postponed for up to 9 months. Financial assistance will be given to the victims and their families, as well as to those that are still waiting for their loved ones to return. This is the 7th time the Korean government has designated special disaster zones. Past cases include the collapse of Sampoong department store in 1995, which resulted in 1,445 casualties, and a major oil spill in Danwon County on the country's west coast in 2007, which resulted in damages worth more than $700 million.
For those curious about what transpired between the wheelhouse and the Marine Traffic Control Center earlier in the afternoon, the transcript and an audio file were released. Does it solve any of the mystery surrounding the crew's behavior?
Well, Sean, some say it has added even more mystery to the crew's behavior. What people are wondering is why the crew members left the sinking ferry before the passengers on board. Take a listen. No, it's difficult to make out what the two sides are saying exactly, even if you speak Korean. But what's evident is that the situation sounds quite dire. The released transcript shows that the control center first contacted the sinking ferry at 9:06 a.m. Wednesday. They made contacts 11 times and communicated for 31 minutes. At 9:12 a.m., the ferry was already severely tilted. The crew member who was talking to the control center already knew that the people on board were not able to move. The control center told the ferry that the captain needs to decide whether to order passengers to abandon the vessel, since it didn't know, the control center didn't know the situation there. That was around 9:25 a.m. But the ferry said it was unable to make announcements because its speaker system was down. And the last time the two made contact was at 9:37 a.m. when the ferry told the control tower that only the people who were able to escape to the left side of the ferry were able to leave the vessel.
Hyun-kyung, does the transcript show who was communicating with the ferry?
Yusan, the transcript doesn't show who was communicating, but we are getting reports that it was a senior crew member. Whether the captain was in the steering room is still unknown. Captain Lee Jun-seok is facing tremendous criticism for escaping the ship before the passengers. So what we need more information on is whether the captain indeed neglected his duty by not promptly notifying the passengers about the situation during that 30-minute time frame.
What's the latest on the investigation into the accident? How is that progressing?
Well, Prosecutor General Kim Jin-tae ordered an investigation into the Seoul ferry operator, the Cheonghaejin Marine Company, that's separate from the one that's currently being conducted by a joint investigation team composed of the police and the prosecution. The prosecution speculates the disaster occurred possibly due to a management failure. Travel bans have been imposed on the operator's president, Kim Han-sik, as well as Yoo Byung-eun, the former chairman of the operator's parent firm, and his two sons, who are the biggest shareholders of the company. The joint investigation team also ordered travel bans on some 40 personnel from the company, including the crew members that were aboard the sinking ferry. Back to you both.
All right, thank you, Hyun-kyung, for that update. Rescue teams have retrieved more bodies from inside the hull of the ferry on this Sunday. Unfortunately, it looks like we can expect the death toll to rise even more in the coming hours and days.
Let's go live to our Hwang Sung-hee and Chi Myung-gil at Paengmok-hang Harbor, the focal point of the search and rescue operation. Sung-hee, today nobody received the good news they were hoping for, but some families may be able to definitively know the fate of their loved ones.
That's right, Sean. Dozens of bodies were retrieved today after the divers gained access to the inside of the vessel for the first time late last night. However, no news of any survivors yet. As of now, the official death toll stands at 58. Now, throughout the day, we have been seeing boat after boat returning from the site of the sunken ferry, but unfortunately, these were all carrying bodies and no survivors. Hundreds of family members of the victims are camping out here, but so far, they've only been met with disappointing and heartbreaking news.
It is heartbreaking, but we are hoping for some good news as search and rescue operations will continue throughout the night. Rescue teams will continue their search for survivors with 20 to 30 divers operating simultaneously. Some progress was also made in the rescue operations today as the divers have attached 5 guide ropes to the vessel, opening new routes into the ferry.
That's right, and just a couple of hours ago, the South Korean Maritime Minister paid a visit to the Paengmok-hang Harbor here to check on the rescue operations, and he did face some heavy criticism from the family members of the victims who view the rescue operations as rather hampered. And earlier today, we also heard about the first death from the rescue team. A Navy sailor who was taking part in the rescue operation has died. He fell into a coma after hitting his head on Wednesday and passed away last night in the hospital. And as the search for survivors continue, will the weather work in our favor tomorrow, Myung-gil?
Yes, Hong-hee, the weather will work in favor tomorrow. The weather conditions will be clear with tidal waves reaching around 1 meter level. As rescue operations have gained momentum, we hope that the missing 244 passengers will miraculously come back to their loved ones who are waiting anxiously at the Paengmok-hang Harbor. Back to you at the studio.
Good news has definitely been so hard to come in recent days. That was our Chi Myung-gil and Hwang Sung-hee reporting live from the closest harbor to the ferry disaster site.
Well, during the rescue operations over the past few days, many on the scene had hoped to use underwater vehicles to help locate victims of the Seoul disaster, especially when divers themselves couldn't go into the water.
But strong tidal currents and limited visibility have made that very difficult. Our Park Ji-won tells us what technologies have accompanied the search efforts.
This is a remotely operated underwater vehicle called the Hemire, developed by the Korea Institute of Ocean Science and Technology. This unmanned vehicle can dive up to 6,000 meters to the bottom in the sea and move at a speed of about 2.8 kilometers per hour. This multifunctional deep submergence vehicle is equipped with robotic arms, a diverse set of measuring instruments, and an underwater camera. Some question whether this state-of-the-art unmanned underwater vehicle can provide any help in the ongoing rescue operations of the Seoul ferry. However, experts say the vehicle was developed for the purpose of deep-sea exploration, where currents are not very strong.
The tidal current speeds near the Seoul accident site are about 8 kilometers per hour. The propulsion of the underwater vehicle needs to be at least twice that.
Another piece of equipment that could help is this so-called diving bell, which provides an air pocket where divers can breathe. Deployed near divers, it can lengthen the amount of time they can stay underwater.
Divers now have to wait for the currents to stop because strong tidal currents have been hampering their operations. This can be a shelter for divers, and divers can continue dives for 20 hours.
The establishment of systemic technology support by revamping remotely controlled submergence vehicles and innovative diving technology is ever the more urgent to save lives during maritime disasters. Park Ji-won, Arirang News.
families of those missing from the sunken Seoul ferry have been congregating at an auditorium near the accident site in Jindo.
This is the fifth day of what has been an agonizing waiting period for all of them. Our Hwang Ji joins us now live from the auditorium. Ji, what have you been seeing?
Guys, it's relatively calm here, but the air is extremely heavy. When families confirm that a newly discovered body is that of their own child, howls of horror, cries of grief fill the auditorium. And now a television screen that you see behind me is showing a list of descriptions of what the deceased were wearing and along with other identifying characteristics so the families can identify their loved one. It really is heartbreaking. Anger toward the government is also mounting among the families. They're saying the rescue operation is proceeding too slowly. Some are taking to the stage to make speeches about their increasing frustration. Rumors are also spreading among families here about how the bodies are handled. Families believe the bodies are not treated properly. Some people have even collapsed while others have headed to Paengmok Harbor to see the site with their own eyes. Now, many of them have returned to the auditorium. Medical personnel are on 24-hour standby here in what is a very tense and agonizing environment.
All right, Jia, thank you for that update, and please do stay with us for more details in our next newscast.
Although it was a relatively quiet early morning at the Mokpo Hospital nearby the search and rescue site, things got really busy later on.
And to get a wrap-up on what happened throughout the day at the hospital, we turn now over to our SJ Lee standing by. Now, SJ, you were at the scene all throughout the day. Tell us what happened.
Now, just like you said, that's right. It was relatively quiet in the beginning of the mornings, but shortly after, the officials at the hospitals did come to tell us that the 10 bodies that were recovered in the early day were headed over to the hospital. Of course, none of those bodies did actually arrive at the hospital, but it is speculated that all of them have quickly been transferred to Ansan after they were identified. But at 4 p.m., the first ambulance arrived with one of the bodies recovered, including 2 family members in the ambulance, a sign that the body was identified. Now, 30 minutes later, a second ambulance arrived, but no family member in the ambulance, which meant the body was yet to be identified.
And I understand there was a briefing on the current conditions of the survivors at the hospital. How are they doing?
Not so good. Now at 1:30 p.m., some of the doctors at the psychiatric center did come to talk to the reporters and tell us the current conditions of the survivors here in the hospital. And it seems like all the hospitals, all the survivors right now are going through some kind of PTS, check that, and roughly half of them are currently under medication, which is a sign that it is severe. Now, one of the fathers of the missing students suffered a stroke because of stress, and some of the survivors are suffering from depression and even amnesia, where they have forgotten all that happened on that fateful day. And that is going to do it for me here at the Mokpo-hang Hospital. Back to you guys at the studio.
Thank you, SJ. And speaking of the deceased, when bodies are recovered, they go through a series of identification procedures to ensure accuracy.
But to speed up the process and help identify the deceased, medical staff have begun collecting DNA samples from the families of the missing. Kim Min-ji explains.
When bodies are recovered, the first procedure is to check the personal belongings of the victim and their physical appearance, such as their height. If the body is able to be identified, the family is contacted so they can confirm with their own eyes. If the body cannot be identified, the body is sent to a nearby hospital for examination, which includes taking DNA samples and fingerprint identification. Blood tests and biopsies are taken if the recovered body has been severely damaged. However, with fears of a sudden rush of bodies being recovered at once and complaints that the procedures have been inefficient, medical experts have begun collecting DNA samples from relatives of the missing passengers. Tents to collect DNA have been set up beside the auditorium, where many families of the missing passengers have been spending sleepless nights, as well as at the Paengmok-hang harbor near the site of the accident. While rescue divers are putting in great efforts to search for survivors and recover bodies, the time that has passed and the harsh conditions at sea could now make it difficult to identify the bodies. Almost 90% of relatives of the missing have registered their DNA. Although they are still clinging on to hope their loved ones are still alive, some are preparing for the worst.
My wife still wants to believe our child will come back alive, but looking at the situation now, I just hope our child's body comes back soundly at least.
With unfavorable weather and harsh conditions at sea hampering rescue efforts, the physical and mental health of the families are also deteriorating by the minute.
I took care of my niece for 11 years. I'm so upset. I told her to have a safe trip and she said yes. Since then, I've heard nothing.
Navy officials say the DNA samples will be analyzed as soon as possible. The DNA samples will be sent to the National Forensic Center to see if they match with the victims. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
With hope fading that additional survivors will emerge from the sunken Seoul ferry, how will those who remain behind cope with the recent trauma?
Psychological services are available for survivors and family members of the missing, but not many people are known to use the services, and how much more treatment is needed long after this initial event passes. Joining us now is Dr. Laah Hyun-kyung from Samsung Medical Center. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Tan.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Well, even though the survivors could be considered extremely lucky to be alive, they will have to live with the trauma of this sinking in the form of post-traumatic stress disorder. What symptoms are they displaying, and what happens if they don't get treatment?
Well, I've heard reports that there have been many students who have displayed high levels of anxiety and depression, and they are already undergoing treatment, which is reassuring. The symptoms of post-traumatic stress can include re-experiencing the traumatic event in the form of bad dreams or flashbacks, having trouble sleeping, feeling irritable or emotionally numb, or having overwhelming guilt or shame. They may also avoid people, places, objects, or events that remind them of the traumatic situation. Severe depression and thoughts of suicide can accompany the extreme guilt of survivors. If friends or family detect suicidal thoughts or behavior in a survivor, this must be treated as a medical emergency, and the person should be taken to the hospital immediately for evaluation and treatment. Also, if post-traumatic stress does not get properly treated, it can lead to substance abuse and severe mood disorders such as depression later on.
Well, students of the affected high school, whether survivors or those who stayed behind, will go back to classrooms that will be noticeably emptier. How do you treat adolescents? What do they need at this point?
Well, one small piece of good news is that children and adolescents tend to be quite resilient, and the majority of them who undergo this type of stressful situation will eventually return to normal life after weeks, months, or years. In terms of treatment, they need to be in a safe, calm, and supportive environment. They need to be listened to carefully and patiently, and they should be encouraged to express what is on their minds. Professional psychological counseling should be made available, and it is important to remember that sometimes the symptoms and signs do not show up until months later. So friends and family should be vigilant about detecting changes in behavior or attitude that may signal PTSD.
Well, families of the missing had clung on to hope that air pockets would keep their children alive. How must they transition to the grim reality that their loved ones are dead?
Well, there is a series of a series of stages in the grieving process, including disbelief and an inability to accept the loss. Then there may be anger, depression, guilt, before a parent finally arrives at acceptance. Relatives, friends, coworkers, and people in their faith network all need to be supportive. You know, in Korea, we say that when one's parents pass away, we bury them in the earth, but if one's child has passed away, we bury them in our hearts. Grief counseling and psychiatric treatment may be necessary in some extreme cases.
Many outside observers have been shocked at how obedient the children and passengers were to the announcements to stay put, even though they could have escaped to safety. Is there a strong psychological pull to obey in times of emergency, or do you think Korean cultural hierarchies played a part?
Well, when you are in an unfamiliar situation and in panic mode, It is not unusual to follow the directions of a person whom you believe to be the leader, someone more experienced and authoritative than you are. That being said, I think that we need to examine whether we should be teaching our children how to think and act more independently, and whether the traditional top-down, one-way pattern of communication and teaching is the best educational paradigm.
All right, Dr. Tan from the Sung Medical Center, thank you so much for your insight tonight.
Thank you for having me.
With the world watching the unfolding rescue operation, thoughts and prayers know no borders.
Our Song Ji-sun reports on messages of support pouring in from around the world.
Please join me in praying for the victims of the ferry disaster in Korea and their families. This is what Pope Francis posted on his Twitter account this weekend. The Pope is due to visit Korea in August, becoming the first head of the Catholic Church to make the trip in 25 years. Pope Francis is just one of the countless people who are grieving for the victims of the capsized Seoul ferry around the globe. English Premier League football club Manchester United tweeted that, "Our thoughts are with everybody affected by the ferry disaster in South Korea." Arsenal defender Per Mertesacker tweeted, "My compassion to the families and people in Korea being affected from the Seoul accident," adding in Korean that he prays for a miracle. Ahead of her Korea tour next week, British singer Connie Talbot tweeted she's leaving for Korea at such a sad time and said profits from the concert will be directed towards the ferry accident. Over in the Thai capital Bangkok at a prayer event hosted by Nation TV, citizens flagged banners and signs with words of condolences and support for the Korean victims. On the other side of the globe, in downtown Boston, Korean students from Harvard University, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Boston University prayed for the safe rescue of all that were aboard the Seoul ferry. Song Ji-sun, Arirang News.
It has been 5 days since the accident, and the weather has finally decided to cooperate.
And for details, we go to Kim Bo-kyung joining us here in the studio. Bo-kyung, I understand that we're expecting some relief in forecast.
That's right, guys. The coming Tuesday through Saturday is neap tide, which is when the speed of tidal currents are at their slowest and sea levels reach their lowest then. So we should be able to continue with rescue operations with few difficulties from the weather. It's currently about 13.2 degrees on Jindo with light clouds. Today, the weather conditions on Jindo were definitely a lot better compared to the past few days. Visibility on Jindo has opened up to 16 kilometers and the wind speed rose in recent hours, but that is gradually going to decrease, and at the moment it is at 4.5 meters per second. The waves continue to remain fairly calm at 0.9 meters. Tomorrow there will be 4 times when the tidal currents are at their slowest. That'll be at 12:03 a.m., 7:19 a.m., 1:09 p.m., and 6:40 p.m. And the slowdown should continue for approximately an hour each time. Officials say that rescue operations will be concentrated by 12:03 a.m., so hopefully nature will be on our side. Conditions on Jindo will continue to remain in favor through next week. Tomorrow the wave height should be at 0.5 to 1 meters and wind speed will be at 5 to 9 meters per second. That's all the weather updates for Jindo at this hour, and I'll be back with more after midnight.
Thanks, Bo-kyung, and those are the stories we're following at this hour. I'm Choi Yu-sun in Seoul.
And I'm Sean Lim. Stay tuned for the latest on the ongoing sunken ferry rescue operation, or find us online at arirang.co.kr. We'll see you soon.